Hello and welcome. You are watching Lockdown TV. This is the pop-up news and discussion program from UnHerd. Some weeks ago, we made waves with an interview by someone called Professor Neil Ferguson. He was defending his models of impending mass casualty that tilted pretty much Western governments into a lockdown policy in the days following. That was March the 16th. Well, had you been paying attention, 6 weeks before that, there was a column in the Sunday Times on February the 2nd by another Professor Neil Ferguson, who was also warning about a serious problem down the road. And he is joining us down the line from Montana. Hello, Neil.
Hi, Freddie. Yeah, not to be confused with the more famous Neil Ferguson. Thank you to my parents for giving me the Gaelic spelling Niall. I've had enough hate mail from people who can't spell, but I think the people who can spell realise that I'm not the epidemiologist at Imperial College London who predicted that 2.2 million Americans would die if they didn't shut down the economy.
You are the historian, writer, academic.
Correct.
Can describe you as such. So let's get into it, Neil. Let's talk about the time since your Sunday Times column. You've sort of criticised Western governments for the lockdowns and for being kind of overreacting in a sense, but you've also criticised them for being underprepared and somewhat sluggish. What would you like to have seen being done by countries like the US and the UK from February the 2nd?
Well, it would have been nice if, after all the 36-page biodefense strategy documents and the acts of Congress, after all the various assistant secretaries for pandemic preparedness had been paid, if we'd actually had an effective strategy for a pandemic. But it turned out that when the rubber hit the road, all the bureaucrats with their PowerPoints were in fact completely ineffective. And so the first point to establish is that on paper, the United States and the United Kingdom were prepared for a pandemic. In practice, they weren't. Secondly, we know how it's supposed to be done because the Taiwanese did it. And the Taiwanese are, as you may realize, rather closer to the People's Republic of China than we are. As soon as they heard even the first rumor of a problem in Wuhan, they wisely didn't believe what the Chinese said officially. They began testing and they began contact tracing to identify anybody who'd been in contact with somebody who tested positive. As a result of this very early detection, early action approach, Taiwan has had no need for an economic lockdown and minimal fatalities. Last time I looked, single digits. So we know how this is supposed to be done. The South Koreans also did a pretty good job. In fact, a bunch of governments, even in the English-speaking world, Australia and New Zealand, have done pretty well. So I think it's very, very clear that something went terribly wrong in the public health bureaucracies of the UK and the US. And most of the journalistic commentary focuses excessively on decision-making at the top by President Trump and Prime Minister Boris Johnson, not realizing that the real failure happened further down in the depths of the administrative state. So
let me just challenge you on that a little bit, because we spoke earlier today to a guy called Jerome Kim from Seoul in South Korea, and he was describing what life was like and what the regimen was like. And, you know, with the apps, with the amount of kind of surveillance, it turns out when they had that recent nightclub outbreak, they've actually tested 65,000 people on the back of that single individual. And I just wonder, is it actually a realistic strategy for a liberal Western democracy to try to get that kind of level of technology and surveillance going on with their people? Will people sign up to it, and will they obey those kind of rules in Western countries?
Well, is it remotely credible that a free society would willingly shut down its economy for weeks on end and confine its people to their homes? We just did an enormous violation of individual liberties, which didn't even have the defense that it was an effective way of preventing the spread of the virus. So these kinds of arguments just strike me as extraordinarily myopic. We've done as much harm as we possibly could have done to individual liberty, and it hasn't even worked. What they've done in Taiwan and South Korea has been to take advantage of the technology that we can all now carry around with us in our smartphones to do a much more effective form of contagion containment. Remember, there are two things you have to understand in a case of contagion. The thing that's contagious, the virus, whether it's biological or digital, and the social network that it attacks. That was an argument that I made again and again in my most recent book, The Square and the Tower. And so that's what the Taiwanese and South Korean systems do. And the less efficient system in Singapore is similar. The alternative, Freddie, is once we come out of lockdown, having cratered our economies, we just drift back to the original herd immunity strategy. And the problem about that is that we'll end up with much higher levels of excess mortality than in countries that are able to do testing and contact tracing. So you're playing whack-a-mole one way or another, because the virus will keep popping up wherever it gets a chance to spread. The question is whether you're going to play whack-a-mole with the blindfold on or actually see the moles. I think finally that there is a great confusion in many people's minds about how contact tracing can be compatible with individual privacy. And I understand why that confusion has arisen, because big internet companies have been so reckless in the way that they've used personal data. And we have failed to reform that state of affairs, despite many warnings by me and others since 2016. So we've only got ourselves to blame that people are wary of big tech. But really, there is a way of doing this that protects the privacy of individuals, anonymizes the data, and makes sure that it's deleted after the emergency. This is an emergency measure in a major public health emergency. We do emergency measures of all kinds in crises, whether it's a pandemic or a war. There's a general understanding, or at least there should be, that it's for the duration and not beyond. And I think that's applicable here.
So the alternative sort of strategy that you mentioned there, I mean, we've been paying a lot of attention to what Sweden is doing. They don't use the phrase herd immunity, but that's basically what they seem to be going for. They're not doing extensive tracing, contact testing, those kinds of things. Isn't the kind of advantage of that approach, if you can get past it and don't have too terrible casualty levels, that at least there's an end? You know, a kind of long-term world of all of your credit card transactions being followed and every mobile phone you come in contact with might be less appealing than a world where at least you endure some pain for a period, but then can actually get back to the old normal.
Well, I think most countries are actually going to end up, at least most Western countries are going to end up doing something like what Sweden has done, only more slowly. And the only argument for proceeding more slowly is that we still don't know all that we need to know about this virus and the disease it causes. There could be some real nasty surprises that the Swedes have gambled won't come along. For example, it might turn out that there actually is lasting harm to young people who get the virus, even if they don't suffer a lung collapse of the sort that kills elderly people. We don't know. So there's an element of risk involved in herd immunity, whether you call it that or not. I think that if there's no systematic testing and contact tracing in the West, we're all going to be Sweden eventually. Because ultimately, what you do when you lock down an economy is, sure, you buy yourself some time and you avoid overrunning your hospitals. But then when you reopen the economy, unless something very mysterious has happened to the virus, then it resumes its business of spreading. And although social distancing will do quite a bit to limit that, the more we try to get back to economic normality, the more likely outbreaks are going to be. No country is anywhere close to herd immunity as it's conventionally defined, that we have to be about 70% of people having been infected and acquired immunity. Nobody's there, not even Sweden, incidentally. So that's part one of the answer. Part two of the answer is, do you not realize that your data, your location data, is already gathered by Facebook and Google and Apple? They know all that about you already. They know who you've been with. The trouble is they don't use it for any public good at all. They use that vast trove of data purely in order to maximize their returns from advertising and other sources of revenue. So the idea that we're somehow currently protected from big data knowing and big tech knowing about our movements, and that we'd be losing this if we had contact tracing, is just absurd. The whole point of a contact tracing strategy is you take advantage of the fact that the data are out there and the apps exist and the devices exist, and you actually put it all to some public good, something that the tech companies, shockingly in my view, have been extremely slow to do unprompted. And I think that there needs to be much more attention on the question, why is it that there's this reluctance to do contact tracing in the United States, the home of the internet, the place where big technology was invented? And the answer is that the big tech companies do not think it is in their interests to do this. And that is a scandal that journalists seem entirely to have missed.
So you can I can believe that countries like the UK, possibly Western European countries, might, after a huge effort and investment, get somewhere close to a kind of South Korean regime. US, it will be state by state. You can sort of see how democratic states might do it, and then some of the interior states might eventually get on board. What about the developing world? I mean, where are you going to draw the line here? Are we going to be hoping that African nations are going to get this kind of regime going? Are all countries in the world going to do this? Or will there be a sort of infected zone and then a kind of zone where people are trying to suppress the virus?
Well, I think the first thing to grasp is that this is something that could be done voluntarily by individuals if the app were made available on the App Store, and we could just choose whether or not to do it. And I would have thought that most people in their networks of friends and family would quite quickly see the benefit of knowing if they or their loved ones had been in contact with somebody carrying the virus SARS-CoV-2, and it would spread spontaneously, particularly in high-risk areas like big cities. So that's part one. It doesn't need to be state mandated, and it doesn't need to be 100% take-up. You just need, as with any future program of vaccination, should a vaccine be made available, you need to target the vulnerable. And that's, again, a smart approach to pandemic containment. Remember, we've taken the dumb approach. Do nothing when it's getting started, then shut the economy down and confine everybody, regardless of their vulnerability, to their homes, cratering the economy. Remember, Freddie, we have created the single biggest economic shock since the Great Depression, and it is happening roughly 12 times faster than the Great Depression. In other words, what took a year in the early 30s now takes a month. Great work, everybody. This is a disaster. It's economically far bigger as a disaster than the pandemic itself as a public health emergency. And so when people tell me, oh, we can't do these sophisticated things, I listen with some incredulity. I mean, we could have done them in January, February if we'd had our eyes open, and we could have averted this economic disaster. As for the African countries, it may be early days, it's hard to be sure, but there is some evidence that at least some African countries, which after all have rather more experience of dealing with contagious diseases than many Northern Hemisphere countries, are doing quite well. Senegal, Ghana, even South Africa is surprised, I think, how well things are going. That could all change, and I suspect it probably will over time. But there's no reason why you shouldn't have similar kind of apps in any country. The smartphone is the ubiquitous tool. More or less every population now has access to this kind of technology. There are some exceptions, but the smartphone is a truly universal tool. And so there's no particular reason why it shouldn't be used by people in Ghana in just the same way as it could be used by people in Britain.
So you don't share my concern then that at least in the medium term, we might see a kind of division between groups of countries that have succeeded in suppressing the virus, who will then have more open borders to each other, and then countries that either have chosen, like Sweden, not to try to suppress it completely, or have just not been successful, which will then be kind of considered in some sort of other group that shouldn't be allowed to flow into the more pure areas? You don't worry that we're going to see a kind of separation between groups of nations like that?
No, I don't, because in fact, the trajectory of the virus seems to be quite similar in most places, regardless of the government measures that are introduced. If you look at the Oxford Blavatnik school data set on government stringency, there is no correlation whatsoever between the level of stringency and the extent of the outbreak in relative terms. So the world is essentially moving, lurching towards higher and higher proportions of people being infected. The death toll is rising inexorably each day. Excess deaths vary from country to country quite strikingly. But I don't think there is a kind of a two-world story here. In truth, every country is going to need to monitor much more strictly travelers who come in from abroad. If you want to fly into Hong Kong right now, on arrival, you submit to a test and you're kept there for a good 8 hours until it's clear whether you're COVID-19 positive or not. Right now, you can just fly into Heathrow, understand there aren't even temperature checks. No, there are two kinds of country in this world, the smart and the stupid. And the stupid countries will certainly have higher excess mortality over time than those that do this in a smart way. That seems like the real distinction.
So let's talk about these lockdowns for a moment. I mean, the Western countries that you're talking about, once they had missed that opportunity to do a South Korea or a Taiwan, and they had already established big infections in their people, are you then of the opinion that the full legally mandated lockdown was overreach and was not necessary, and they should have just done a kind of social distancing recommendation? Or what do you think they should have done, having already failed at the first hurdle? What should they have done at the second?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the social distancing that people chose to do without necessarily being forced to do it was more effective in slowing down the spread of the disease and lowering the effective reproduction number than the state-mandated lockdowns or shelter-in-place orders. Now, it's early to make that kind of assessment, but the data I've seen, including the Oxford Blavatnik data on stringency, strongly suggest that the government measures, and particularly the economic lockdown, did not have anything like the public health benefits to justify the massive economic costs of what has ensued. So I said that at the time. If you've missed the opportunity for early detection and early action, then the next stage is social distancing. Remember, it's not a homogeneous population, and the research on this is very clear. You have to understand the network structure. You have to understand why some countries, like, say, Italy, were more vulnerable than Japan, ex ante, because of social structures and social habits. Once you recognize that it's not the homogeneous population that the epidemiologists typically use in their models, and that there are significant differences in susceptibility and significant differences in the likelihood of dying between different groups, then an intelligent approach seeks to prevent the vulnerable groups from being infected while not constraining those groups that really aren't so vulnerable. So again, it's all about whether you're going to be smart about this or use a blunt instrument while wearing a blindfold.
So if you're right, and I think you are, that the evidence is not there that the full legal mandate was necessary everywhere, then it's a huge self-inflicted wound by the West, potentially. And it's very strange that it's not really allowed to be said. You know, I noticed that no party in British politics is even referencing any hint of kind of that there might have been an overreaction, because that doesn't suit anyone's narrative. And in the US, you know, we've been interviewing some scientists who take divergent views, and I get emails from appalled Democrat friends who think that it's kind of real evil talk to even question those lockdowns. So how did we get into the position where questioning that lockdown policy has become such a taboo?
I think because we went from complacency to panic, and by we I mean the political classes broadly defined. Remember, in late January, when President Trump called for a ban and indeed ordered a ban on Chinese passengers coming into the United States, he was widely criticized and accused of racism and xenophobia in the liberal media. And in fact, you were more likely to see the new coronavirus dismissed as just the seasonal flu in the liberal media than in the conservative media at that time. One of the few journalists who actually got this right was Tucker Carlson on Fox. It's just a pity that Sean Hannity wasn't listening to Carlson, because then Fox's coverage would have been better. Then we swung in mid-March, thanks partly to Neil Ferguson's report, with its horrendous projections of mass death, from complacency to panic. And liberals who quite like telling people what to do and bossing individuals around, latched onto the idea of lockdowns, starting in California and then somewhat later in New York. And this then became the new virtue signaling. Wearing a mask and bossing around your neighbors or telling on them was the new virtue signaling. And it was amazing how quickly the people who'd been saying it was just the influenza decided it was in fact the Black Death. And so that, I think, explains this strange grey zone that we've entered, where it's actually very difficult to have a sane discussion about policy options. The public has been confused because first it was the influenza and then it was the Black Death, or to be more exact, the 1918-19 influenza pandemic, one of the worst in all of history, which, by the way, was what Neil Ferguson's model implied. Basically, that model implied that we were going to repeat 1918-19. Yeah. Now, if that had been right, it would have been reasonable for people to be very frightened. But I actually don't think any of the data that have since come out support the very high infection fatality rate that he was assuming. On the contrary, most, though there are some exceptions, point to an infection fatality rate in roughly the 0.5 to maybe 0.7% range. Now, you ask yourself why we're not having a sane discussion. Another reason is that governments have acted in ways that have, in fact, reduced the incentive for people to get back to work. I mean, if you're getting paid by Rishi Sunak or Steve Mnuchin just to stay at home as spring unfolds, there are worse situations to be in. I mean, in the US, more than half of workers ended up better off with unemployment payments than they were in work. If you set the English up with the option to stay at home and garden rather than go to work and continue to pay them, don't be surprised if they say don't end the lockdowns. First of all, you told them it was the 1918-19 influenza that killed nearly 3% of the world's population, and then you told them that you would pay them to do nothing. Is it so surprising that people are reluctant to end the lockdowns?
So let's zoom out a little bit, Neil. We've looked at the kind of the few weeks around these decisions. Let's try and look ahead to months or years. It looks like if we think of this as part of the kind of Western Asian dynamic, it looks like the Asian governments have responded better broadly, and their economies will be less badly hit, whilst Europe and North America are going to suffer very badly. Do you see this as kind of fast forwarding a process that was already underway, whereby Europe and North America are kind of weaker in the world geopolitics?
Well, I've been writing about this for a while now in my book Civilization, which will soon be nearly 10 years old. It was a central theme that the world was fundamentally shifting away from Western dominance to something at least more balanced. And that process has been going on really since the 1980s and has accelerated since around 2001. So this is certainly not a new trend. I think one has to be a little hesitant about assuming that we're screwed and they're fine, because the Asian economies are heavily dependent on globalization working. It's quite hard for South Korea and Taiwan to have economic growth if everybody else is, at least everybody in the West, is in the deepest recession since the early 1930s. It's not even clear that China can achieve a V-shaped recovery. They're trying. They've got everybody back to work pretty much, but consumer demand is still in the doldrums because people are very reluctant to go out spending money. A, they feel that they should save against some future crisis, and B, who wants to go shopping? I mean, who wants to go to a restaurant? Who wants to go and be entertained? So I think everybody is in many ways in the same boat. The global economy as a whole, as the IMF showed last month, is heading for its worst performance really since the IMF was created, and no one's really going to be exempt from that, no matter how well they've handled the pandemic. I think there's another kind of geopolitical question though, Freddie. I mean, people are writing articles more or less one per day saying the end is nigh for the United States, and it's going to be the Asian century after all. I mean, please. These articles are premature, that they're failing to see the potentially very serious systemic problems that have been created by the virus in China. I stand by the analogy. This is Xi Jinping's Chernobyl. It is going to bring the Chinese economy to a much lower growth rate than they were intending this year. And I'm not sure that the system is stable to that kind of a shock. Back in the 1980s, Paul Kennedy published The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, around about the same time as the Chernobyl disaster happened, actually. And the central theme of that book was that the United States was done for, like Ancien Regime France, crushed by Reagan's deficits and debt, and the future belonged to West Germany and Japan. So, I think there's one clear lesson of history, and that is do not write articles predicting the decline and fall of the United States. You will look silly.
So we might even see, just extending that for a moment, there might be, it might be that the great innovations of the kind of post-COVID world end up coming out of America. It may be that they actually emerge after a kind of shaky start, stronger than ever.
That would be my historian's bet. After all, stock markets were cheerful this week, not because of a vaccine breakthrough in China. China, after all, has a completely disastrous record on vaccines. There was a scandal not so long ago of a vaccine that killed the people it was given to, and they actually had to execute the head of their one of their public health agencies for corruption. No, the probability is that if a vaccine is indeed going to be found, will be found either in the United States or in a country closely allied to it, potentially the United Kingdom. I mean, great things are being done at my alma mater, Oxford. So, yeah, I mean, two ways of thinking about this. One, if you want a vaccine for a new pathogen, who do you go to? A, China, B, the United States, and the answer is clearly B. Second question, in the case of a really major financial crisis, to which central bank do you apply for assistance? A, the People's Bank of China, B, the Federal Reserve. The answer is, again, B. The Fed has been clearly the dominant financial institution in this crisis, playing a much bigger role in many ways than the IMF. So, all of these journalistic hot takes on it's all over for America are largely predicated on journalists' deep aversion to Donald Trump. Now, I can understand people finding Donald Trump a personally distasteful person, and I don't think he's been a great president at all. But as I said earlier in our interview, this crisis is not really about Trump. It's about a failure of the administrative state, the bureaucracy, that Trump voters elected him to fix, or at least to break up. And what's clear, very clear from the pandemic, is that the deep state is still there, very much there, and very much dysfunctional. This is a great failure for big government, contrary to the arguments of those Democrats who would like to say this proves the need for even bigger government.
So you've mentioned the T word, Donald Trump. Obviously, the election is sort of upon us already. There's some idea that this is going to be a catastrophe for Donald Trump because bad handling and the polls don't look good for him. Alternatively, it might be something that sort of takes attention away from some of those failings and gets people in a kind of nationalistic mood that might suit him. Where do you stand? Is this going to end up being a positive or negative for Trump re-election prospects?
Well, it's hard to see how it's it's positive. So much of Trump's appeal was that he was going to cause the economy to surge, and the campaign was going to be based on keeping America great after he'd made it great. And then along came COVID-19 and the biggest financial and economic crisis since the early 1930s. So on any standard model of how the US political system works, the incumbent is toast if the economy is as badly affected as it currently is. On the other hand, before we start predicting landslides, it's worth remembering, firstly, that the Democrats have ended up nominating a truly weak candidate, widely believed to be senile and more or less invisible at this point in American public life. And moreover, secondly, the central revelations of the pandemic reinforce a Trumpian narrative more, I think, than they reinforce Biden's. We see very clearly that China is a bad actor, and that has been one of the leitmotifs of Donald Trump's political career since he relaunched it with his 2015-2016 campaign. Secondly, if anything was calculated better to show the importance of national borders that can strictly be policed, I can't think of it. The pandemic has been, in Europe as much as in North America, an illustration that national borders are crucial for the safety of citizens. And that is the second core leitmotif of Donald Trump's career. Finally, I think one shouldn't underestimate his uncanny ability to use social media, the new landscape in which politics plays out, in ways that completely outthink and outsmart his Harvard and Yale and Princeton educated opponents who think they've got him. They're all as confident now as I think they were at this stage in 2016 of victory. It's going to be a very big shock to them if, after all of this and in the face of this calamity, which certainly Trump has not handled well, he manages to sneak home. Though I must admit, my great fear is actually that the result will be an inconclusive one, as in 2000. There'll be more than one state, actually, where the result will be contested. God alone knows what the results will be as mail voting, postal voting is increasingly important. And if we end up with a contested result in the early hours of November the 4th, then maybe those predictions of American demise will start looking more credible, because I really do not see an easy, quick way out of such an outcome.
So you've given kind of three potential scenarios there, Neil. Can we tempt you towards a more of a prediction of which one you think is most likely at this point?
I think it's smart to start by assuming that this will be decided in a few states, as it was back in 2016. And the key ones will be Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I mean, there are others that may be in play, but that really will be the kind of decisive battleground. When you look at the polling at this point, Trump is certainly in a weaker position, quite a bit weaker than would have been the case in January, or even actually in the early phase of the pandemic, when he had a little bit of a bump because voters were taken in by his apparent command performance. So it's close. It's going to be decided in those states, and a lot is going to depend on what happens economically and in terms of public health in those states between now and November. I think anybody who starts attaching probabilities with high confidence to a US election at this early stage doesn't understand how the country works. Most people are not thinking about this, and they will not think seriously about this until probably after Labor Day. So the smart move, I think, is to say this is closer than it ought to be, given what a total disaster President Trump is presiding over. And it could end up being as tight, actually, as the result of 2016. That the thing to worry about, because the outcomes are so really nasty, is the tie. And I would attach a significant probability to a result so close that it's contested. I'd say there's a sort of 20% probability that maybe 5 or 6 states have contested results. And that would be enough for one side to say, this isn't a clear-cut result, and it would not be like Gore v. Bush. This would take a lot longer to sort out, and that seems to me like the worrying scenario to which you have to attach some significant probability.
That would not be pretty. Before we let you go, Neil, I want to take you back over the Atlantic to the UK. There we've seen support for the government at kind of historic highs during this crisis. The Tories have been polling at more than 50%. Then there was that weird week when Boris Johnson himself was seriously unwell. And now, as they're sort of trying to come out of this, the other side, they seem to be faltering, and the numbers are going down very quickly. And suddenly the government doesn't look so strong. What's your view of where Boris Johnson is now and with the British government?
Well, I wish you could take me over to the UK. I miss my older children and my mother who are there, and I have no idea when I'm next going to be able to see them other than like this via Zoom. If you're sitting in darkest Montana, it's best not to opine with too much confidence about politics in London or indeed in the wider UK. I think it was inevitable that there would be some kind of decline in Boris Johnson's approval, simply because the drama of his illness and then classic Johnson move resurrection on Easter Sunday was bound to wear off as it sank in that the UK is in a terrible economic mess. I think the Bank of England came up with the wonderful observation that it was the worst economic crisis since 1709. Only the Bank of England has data sets that go back to 1709. It was therefore, I think, almost inevitable that people would start to scratch their heads and ask, have we really done this right? And then there's the very important reality that the Labour Party has a credible leader again after the strange detour into the fantasy land of Jeremy Corbyn. And Keir Starmer is very obviously an electable person, unlike his predecessors. So I'd say the big issue in the UK is going to be the creeping nasty suspicion that we've handled this worse than our European counterparts. And it makes Brexit as a project not only less important than it used to be, but also somehow strangely less convincing than it used to be. I mean, if Brexit meant anything, it would surely be that the UK would handle a crisis better than those bureaucratic continentals. But the horrible possibility dawns that we are doing this much worse than, say, the Germans, who've actually done pretty well in terms of their public health response and now their economic response. So I sense that as it sinks in that the UK is really one of the world's worst in terms of excess mortality, and that its performance in terms of public policy has been really a catalogue of blunders, there's bound to be some political price to pay. Luckily, thanks to the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, doesn't matter. Boris can be really unpopular. He'll still be Prime Minister.
Something, a sort of, we were looking for some sort of optimistic note to end there. I'm not sure if that quite counts. We've painted quite a bleak and worrying picture of the world. But it was great to hear from you, Neil, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
It's been a pleasure, Freddie.
You have been watching Lockdown TV from UnHerd. That was Neil Ferguson, not the epidemiologist, but the historian and academic, all the way from Montana, talking about what sort of world we're going to be living in after this crisis. Thanks for joining.